Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Penny Dax, AFTD's Senior Director of Scientific Initiatives. In the popular media, there is a lot of discussion around lifestyle and brain health. But what does the data actually tell us about the impact of our daily behaviors on FTD? This session is going to explore what we know about lifestyle and dementia risk more broadly, and summarize the emerging research on cardiovascular health, physical activity, and cognitive activity on FTD. Joining us for this discussion is Dr. Kaitlin Casaletto, a scientist practitioner, board-certified neuropsychologist, and associate professor at the University of California, San Francisco Memory and Aging Center. Dr. Casaletto leads a research program identifying novel biobehavioral targets of dementia prevention. Dr. Casaletto, welcome. She's virtual, by the way.
Thank you, Penny, and thank you so much to the organizers of this AFTD conference for inviting me to speak here today. Sincere apologies that I cannot be there in person. Unfortunately, I had a prior obligation, but I'm thrilled to be here to talk to you about modifiable risk factors in FTD, so things we can think about for our brains now and in the future. Okay, let's get into it. So I actually thought I would start by taking a step back and thinking about, well, what do we know about dementia prevention more broadly? And then dig a little bit more deeply into this space and understand, well, within that, what has been known about FTD? So first, I think the data are promising. Increasingly, we're seeing that up to 40% of dementia cases may be attributable to modifiable risk factors. What do I mean by modifiable risk factors? This was a review that was published in 2020 that summarized 12 of the strongest modifiable risk factors that are associated with dementia risk. You can see they span across the lifespan, things like lower education, hearing loss, smoking and depression, physical inactivity, all across the lifespan. And I think this is a really exciting space because there's also estimates that suggest that if we actually just reduce these risk factors by 10%, we could prevent up to 9 million cases of dementia by 2050. This is just like really low-hanging fruit where we could have huge impact. And how does this work? So I'm here to argue that the brain is a highly dynamic organ. I think many of us think of this brain, this sort of aggregation of cells that are stuck within our skull is pretty static, but the reality is actually quite different. So if we zoom in on this here, in pink is a brain cell or a neuron, and in green are glial cells or the helper cells of the brain. And you can see that the cells are coming in and out of frame, they're touching one another, they're retracting, they're protracting. And this is happening not over the scale of days and weeks, but just a couple hours. And so we've learned from animal studies that there's up to 10% turnover of connections in our brain cells in the adult brain in just 1 week. So this equates to up to 500 new connections that our brains are making in just a week. You know, what an incredible window of opportunity. How do we do this? Well, we think that our life experiences and environments and exposures could be driving these new connections. And this is not new information. This has been known for quite some time. These are data from one of my scientific pioneers, Marianne Diamond, who was a scientist at UC Berkeley, and she studied this in mouse models. So you can see she studied mice and she put them in isolated cages. They had no running wheels to exercise on, no friends to hang out with, no new toys to interact with, and compared them to mice who were housed together socially with exercise opportunities and cognitively stimulating toys. And you can see these are drawings of what a typical brain cell would look like coming out of the isolated mice compared to the mice that were in these enriched housing conditions. That was the only difference between these mice, just the environments that they were in can really shape how our brain cells develop and communicate. And increasingly, we think that part of this is having new experiences, this idea of novelty. So this was a study in mice, and on the y-axis here is neurogenesis, or birth of new neurons. And this studied animals where the animals were not shown any odors, or they were shown a new odor every day across a couple weeks, or they were shown the same odor every day across a couple weeks. And I hope you can appreciate that only the animals that were shown this new novel odor each day were the ones who actually showed the birth of new neurons in their brains. So this idea of new learning can shape the adult brain. So again, we think that there could be rapid and persistent formation of new connections in the adult brain. And it's particularly driven by engagement in new and exciting tasks that that person hasn't quite learned before. So this is my scientific bias. I just want to give you my conflict of interest. This is how I think about the brain when it comes to FTD risk and Alzheimer's risk. So what do we know about FTD and modifiable risk factors at this point? Let's start at the beginning in terms of early life experiences. So education, greater educational attainment, and occupations that are more cognitively enriching are associated with neuroprotection and frontotemporal dementia. So we've seen that higher education and occupational cognitive enrichment is associated with a lower risk of getting sporadic FTD. It's also associated with longer survival with FTD. So these are some data that came out in 2015. And you can see the x-axis is just time for survival. And in the green line, these were individuals with FTD who had professional and technical jobs, so maybe more cognitively stimulating. And hopefully you can see here that the green line extends much further than the blue line, which was occupations that were more routine operative service workers. We also see that having this higher education and occupational enrichment is associated with larger brain tissue volumes and better preservation of that tissue volume over time. So less brain atrophy once someone develops FTD. And there's been one study that has also linked this to cognitive performances, so better cognitive outcomes. So we think these early life exposures that can enrich our brain are potentially neuroprotective or associated with neuroprotection in FTD. And it's not just those early life experiences. There have now been a couple of studies that have showed that cognitively stimulating leisure activities in later life are also associated with better neuroprotection. So these are things like reading, writing, hobbies, hanging out with friends, playing an instrument, things that engage our brain in new and stimulating ways. And so one study has shown that looking at people who have behavioral variant FTD, that those patients that had more cognitively stimulating leisure activities in their day-to-day life had less brain tissue loss, and that's the highlighted in red here. And then a study from our group, this was examining people who had autosomal dominant risk for frontotemporal dementia, so people who carried the highest genetic risk for FTD. And we asked the mutation carriers at baseline, how many of these activities were they doing? And we found, as you can see here, in the blue line, that individuals who carried these FTD mutations but had high levels of cognitive activities had slower progression of their functional decline over time compared to the mutation carriers who had fewer of these activities in their day-to-day life. So together, these data suggest that even later in life, these enriching activities may be associated with neuroprotection in frontotemporal dementia. Okay, and now we're going to shift and talk a little bit about physical activity. And I also wanted to give a little bit of a backdrop here because physical activity has some of the most consistent and some of the largest effect sizes that we've seen for dementia prevention more broadly. So what do we know here? There was a sort of a seminal study back in 2001 that showed that even just walking more city blocks was associated with slower age-related cognitive decline in older women. So just walking more. Increasingly, there's a lot of data now that suggests that low physical activity is significantly associated with increased risk for Alzheimer's disease, pretty large effect sizes. And then this is a study that I just love that looked at midlife fitness. So people in their 40s and 50s, and then followed these individuals 40 years later and found that the individuals who were more fit in midlife had up to an 88% decreased risk of dementia 40 years later. I mean, that's a massive effect size. They also found that even in people who developed dementia, that those that were more fit developed dementia 5 years later, so maybe associated with this later onset. So pretty consistent data and pretty large effect sizes in the broader community. Does this matter in FTD? So what we did is we turned to the All FTD study. I know you've been talking about this today, a whole bunch, but essentially this is a multi-site consortium that studies families who are living with FTD. And we were able to measure in 105 people who carried the 3 of the most common genes for FTD, C9, progranulin, and MAPT. And I'll just point out that over half of our participants were asymptomatic, so they did not have any symptoms of FTD yet. And we just asked them at baseline, at your first visit into the study, how much are you exercising? And this was really broad. This was jogging, yard work, housework, any type of movement. And then we just followed them over time. And we measured their brains, and we measured how they were functioning and their cognition. So what do we find? Essentially, we found that physical activity associated with slower progression in these individuals at the highest genetic risk for FTD. So you can see here on the x-axis that the x-axis here is time, and the y-axis here is functional decline. And people carrying these genetic mutations who had high physical activity at baseline had slower progression, again, of functional decline over time compared to the mutation carriers who had low levels of physical activity. And then in this next plot, it's a little bit different. On the x-axis, we have brain tissue loss over time. And on the x-axis here, or on the y-axis here, we have cognitive performance. And you can see that the mutation carriers who had high levels of physical activity had greater stability of their cognitive performances over time, despite having tissue loss. And this is in contrast to low physical activity folks who we found the more tissue loss they had, the worse their cognitive performances, just as expected. So somehow physical activity was helping these individuals who are at risk to sort of maintain their clinical functioning, even as there may be changes in their brain. And in terms of effect sizes, we found about 2 to 2.5 times slower progression per year between the low and the high physical activity individuals. So of course, we want to know, how is this happening? So we wanted to dig deeper. And I'm sure many of you have heard about this biomarker. It's called neurofilament light chain. This is, or NFL. So this is a protein that helps keep the structure of our brain cells. It's a microtubule protein, props up the structure of our axons. And essentially, we think what's happening is when the brain cells break down, that this NFL spills out into the blood, and we can then quantify how much of our brain cells are breaking down. And this has been found to be one of the best molecular markers of FTD that we have right now. It's particularly elevated in people who have FTD. And you can see that here in this plot where the 3 most common genes for FTD, you can see much higher levels of NFL compared to the yellow line, which is healthy controls. And this NFL can change even very early in disease. So we start to see changes in NFL, maybe even up to 10 years before the disease starts to manifest clinically. So of course we wanted to know, might physical activity associate with this really important molecular marker of FTD, NFL? So we turned back to the All FTD Consortium, and this time they had actually up to 160 individuals now who carry these autosomal dominant risks for FTD. Similarly, a majority of participants were quite early in the disease stage clinically. And again, we asked them about their physical activity at their first study visit, and then we measured their NFL levels over time in blood. And really compellingly, we saw again that greater physical activity associates with the slower progression of NFL over time in these mutation carriers. So here in the x-axis, we have time, and on the y-axis, NFL. and in this light blue color, individuals with the highest levels of physical activity showing slower progression of NFL over time. And if we put this into an effect size, it was, if you compare this sort of blue line to the black line, is between a 14 to 30% slowing of NFL accumulation over 4 years. And interestingly, if we excluded individuals who had dementia stages, so we're showing clinical impairment, and we just looked at people who were asymptomatic, we found very similar effect sizes of physical activity. And to us, this suggests that, if we remove individuals that have really high NFL or maybe low physical activity because they're experiencing cognitive impairment, we're still seeing some of these protective relationships, which might suggest, again, some of this sort of prevention association. And if we dig a little bit more deeply into these data, we wanted to try to understand, well, what types of behaviors are most associated with NFL trajectories? And so each of these plots, we had a self-reported measure of physical activity that had all these different types of activities. And so each of these plots, we broke out the types of physical activity. And I'll just say, the measure is very crude, and these are what we would call post hoc analyses. We weren't especially powered to do this, but it's just a way to get a peek at what we think might be happening. And so essentially, same plots as before, time over the x-axis and NFL over the y. And you can see in individuals who had the highest levels of physical activity, had the slowest progression of NFL, among household activities, yard work, and sports. We also found a slowing even in individuals who walk more. We did not see as large effects, actually really no effects in strength training activities. So we wondered, maybe some of these relationships are driven by activities that are characterized by high cognitive and cardiorespiratory demands. So to summarize together, I think we're fairly convinced now that active lifestyles are associated with better brain health and FTD, even in later life and even at those at the highest possible genetic risk. I think these are pretty convincing data, at least for me, to make sure that I participate in these types of lifestyles as all of us are getting older each day. So in terms of exercise recommendations for FTD, unfortunately, we are not any more precise for FTD than we are for the general population at this point. So we recommend the World Health Organization guidelines, which are essentially 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity movement per week, or 75 to 150 of more vigorous movement per week. And this is cardiorespiratory movement. We also recommend muscle strengthening activities about 2 days a week. And in older adults, making sure to increase balance and strength training a couple days a week to protect against falls and just sort of increase general functioning. All right, let's come back to our beautiful review here. And I just want to highlight a couple of factors here. This is something my graduate student taught me, that if we look at these 12 factors, actually half of them are vascular related. So half of the modifiable risk factors that we know about for dementia prevention are associated with cardiovascular and cardiometabolic health. So what's up with that? So let's think a little bit about heart health and brain health. So when I say vascular health, I'm just talking about the blood vessels of our body and our brain and our heart. So things that affect our vasculature are things like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, smoking, obesity. And why is this important? Well, hopefully you can appreciate this is a model of the vasculature of the brain. And you can see there are just so many incredible, small, intricate blood vessels that traverse all throughout the brain. And this is how the brain gets all of the oxygen and nutrients that it needs. And it's also how the brain dumps out all of the gunk that it's accumulated each day. So when we're sleeping, that all flushes out of our brain through our vascular system. So you can imagine that if we have injuries to these small blood vessels, that might not be so great for the brain tissue that sits right next to it. And this is exactly what we see. So in people who have these cardiovascular risk factors, we often see some of what we call these white matter lesions. They show up as these white dots on brain MRI. These are actually quite common as we get older because our vasculature gets some wear and tear to it. And this is what it looks like on imaging. So we wanted to ask the question of how does this affect frontotemporal dementia risk? And this was a project led by my graduate student, Anna van de Bunte. And so to measure cardiovascular risk, she wanted to look at a really holistic measure. This is called the Life Simple 7. So these are 7 modifiable risk factors that we know are good for cardiovascular health, ranging from blood pressure to exercise and smoking. And I'll just note that higher scores mean that that person has better cardiovascular health. And so, of course, again, we turn back to the All-FTD Consortium to try to answer this question. And you can see that now she had over 200 individuals that carry the 3 most common autosomal dominant mutations for FTD. And we asked for everyone to measure these Life Simple 7 measures just at their first study visit, and then we measured their clinical manifestation over time. And so what she found is that individuals who have these genetic risk factors for FTD, but had better cardiovascular health, had slower progression of memory and language decline over time. So in this plot here, you have time on the x-axis and different cognitive test scores on the y-axis. And in red are those mutation carriers that had the best cardiovascular health indicators at baseline. And you can see a nice positive association or kind of stable association of their cognitive trajectories, especially compared to those with poor cardiovascular health at baseline. Interestingly, when we looked at this in non-carriers, we found that the relationships were not quite so salient. So although you can probably appreciate that those with better cardiovascular health, they're on top here, they have better cognitive performances, we don't see the stark differentiation in those who have poor cardiovascular health on cognition, which suggests to us that perhaps individuals who are at risk for FTD may have a more potent effect of cardiovascular health on their cognitive trajectories, or at least a more specific effect than what we're seeing in the non-carriers. And then if we look at brain outcomes, so that was cognition, and now we're looking at brain outcomes. So again, in the mutation carriers that had the best cardiovascular health at baseline, we saw actually slower accumulation of these white matter lesions in their brain compared to those with low cardiovascular health. And we didn't see a significant relationship on how frontotemporal brain volumes change over time, but we did see that those with better cardiovascular health, they started with higher brain volume at baseline. And again, we didn't see as strong effects in the non-carriers, again, suggesting that perhaps this cardiovascular health indicator could be particularly important in people who have genetic risk for FTD. So in sum, I hope if you take anything home from today's talk, this is probably the best message to take. Take care of your heart to take care of your brain. We have incredibly advanced and effective tools to take care of our heart and our blood vasculature now. And so doing that will inherently take care of your brain. And this is some of the easiest ways that we can help protect our brain as we age. Okay, just a couple of other factors I wanted to run through. And so one is traumatic brain injury, or TBI. And we've been seeing that TBI seems to be overrepresented in individuals who go on to develop FTD. So, what's going on here? So this is a newer, area of study. These are some data hot off the press. They're still under review by a colleague of mine, Breton Askin, who's at University of Florida. And he found that individuals with FTD had a higher representation of having contact sports play. So you can see this here. So more years of contact and collision sports in individuals who had FTD and primary progressive aphasia. And similarly, there were more years of American football play in individuals who had FTD and primary progressive aphasia compared to matched healthy controls, which might suggest a potential risk association in terms of developing FTD and PPA. I think really interestingly, he found also a really nice dose-dependent relationship. So essentially showing that the more TBIs someone has, the younger the age of onset of FTD. So individuals who had 2 TBIs had the youngest age of onset of their FTD symptoms compared to those that didn't have any TBI. And this was also seen here with the years of American football play. So a dose-dependent relationship, more play, younger age of onset. And these data actually align quite nicely with a couple of papers that are out there showing that there's approximately a 3-year earlier age of FTD onset in individuals who have a history of TBI. Also, I think really compellingly, he started to look within some of the groups that we had with behavioral variant FTD, and he found that among the behavioral variant FTD patients, that those that had any exposure to American football actually had poorer memory scores. So even within the syndrome, perhaps a more severe version of the FTD syndrome. So take care of your brains by wearing helmets. And then the last modifiable risk factor I just wanted to touch on is mental health. Our brain also creates our mood, and we have some really effective tools to treat mental health. Why is this? Well, we know that there's an incredibly increased risk of dementia in older adults who also have mood difficulties. So treatment of mood difficulties could be a tool to help prevent future risk of dementia. And really importantly, I think, is that there's about a 70% increased risk of preventable hospitalizations in adults who have both dementia and depression. So again, if we can treat one of these syndromes, perhaps we can help prevent these hospitalizations. And in terms of FTD, you know, the psychiatric symptoms really differ depending on which syndrome someone's presenting with. So these are some data from our group. Down below, you have different types of self-reported mood difficulties that people are experiencing, and then the severity of the mood symptoms. And each of these boxes represents one of our, you know, favorite FTD syndromes here. And you can just see by looking at the plots here that people who are living with PSP or CBS and also semantic variant primary progressive aphasia have some of the highest levels of psychiatric distress. And then the last sort of plug I wanted to give, this was the only randomized clinical trial on a modifiable risk factor that I could find in FTD. But there was a randomized clinical trial on a therapy called mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR, which is a tool to reduce stress and increase mood. And this was conducted in individuals who are carrying FTD mutations, and they found a positive benefit of this MBSR. I think this is actually a really well-studied and incredibly efficacious therapy that's been known outside of FTD for a long time. So it's very promising to see that this could be a potential behavioral tool that we could use to promote mental health in those at risk for FTD. Okay, and as I'm wrapping up, I just wanted to give a shout out that we had a multi-stakeholder workshop this past fall in Philadelphia. And this included people like myself, neuropsychologists, neurologists, genetic counselors, legal experts, as well as individuals from the community, people who are living with elevated genetic risk for FTD and ALS. And the goal was to come together and really think about what are the modifiable risk factors and the clinical management tools that we could get a consensus around in terms of helping to promote health in individuals at risk for ALS and FTD. So we have a paper that summarizes what we landed on that should be coming out soon. So just keep your eyes peeled. So in sum, what have I told you about risk for FTD brains? Essentially factors both in early life, like education and occupation, throughout our life, our heart health, physical activity, and engagement in these social, cognitive, stimulating activities that our brains just soak up and love. These all show associations with better outcomes in frontotemporal dementia. The massive caveat that I have to give to all these data is that all of them, with the exception of that one clinical trial on the mindfulness work, These are all associations, so they're just correlations showing X correlates with Y. We cannot say at this point that having more physical activity will prevent FTD. So I think that work needs to be done in terms of getting some clinical trial work and modifying these risk factors and understanding how they then have benefits downstream. It's the only way we can get at the causal relationship. The other questions that I have are, in the era of precision dementia prevention, who is this going to be most effective with? We have to consider someone's genetic makeup, environmental exposures, prior life experiences. Are these factors going to be most important for? When in the disease are these factors going to be most important? And which factors when in the disease? And what volume? How much of these types of activities do we need? I'm pretty convinced that we don't have to be running marathons for our brain health, but how much is going to be important when it comes to brain health? And we simply don't have the answers yet, but I think we're headed in this direction. So I just, again, want to encourage everyone that I think we can build our brain's resilience. Hopefully, I've convinced you that our brain is more than just a static organ hanging out in our skull. It's incredibly dynamic, it's ever-changing, it's constantly moving. We're traditionally taught that our brain creates our behaviors, but increasingly, I think we're also appreciating that our behaviors can shape our brains. And we can use this as a tool and an opportunity to help build our brain's resilience as we get older and with risk for different types of diseases. So with that, a huge thank you to the All-FTD Consortium, who's been incredibly supportive of this work on modifiable risk factors. And also just a huge thank you to the participants and families that keep me employed with a job and asking these questions that I think are just so important and fascinating. I work with an incredible team that I have to give a shout out to, all of our funders. And please send me questions, comments, if you have any after today's session. Again, I wish I could have been there in person, but happy to answer things on email. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and a wonderful talk and a great overview. So we do have a little bit of time for questions now. Will, do we have any questions from the audience? And just as a reminder to all of you, if you have questions, please write them on the card, and then Will is compiling the questions that comes in from both online and in person to then help us prioritize, please.
We do have some questions queued up. So I think we'll first take one about the impact of apathy in terms of people being actively engaged either in cognitive engagement or physical activity, and whether that was in any way looked at in some of the studies that were highlighted. If we could hear anything about that.
Yeah. Apathy is such a throughput to the FTD syndromes, which is such a common problem that pops up for folks. We did not directly look at apathy in our work. Prior work has looked at some physical activity with apathy and shown benefits. I'll just say, in terms of making behavior change happen, making sure that the individual can engage in behaviors, in someone who's experiencing apathy, it's incredibly difficult to start to build these types of resilience behaviors. So what we would recommend is building out a schedule so that that individual who's experiencing apathy doesn't have to generate a schedule and figure out what they're doing. Instead, they might be able to just, follow along with, okay, today is my jogging day, tomorrow is the play chess with, so-and-so day. And so building out those schedules so we can overcome some of the challenges with apathy. And again, maybe we'll see some movement in apathy with these types of behaviors, but it hasn't necessarily been specifically examined in FTD that I know of yet.
And there was a lot of interest in the work that you highlighted, and I think interest in, if people want to go and find those research studies, do we Google you? Do we go to your lab? What's your recommendation if people want to go back to some of those exercise and engagement studies?
Certainly could Google the All-FTD Consortium website. There's a publication tab on there, and I'd be happy to share that. I'm also happy to share the publications. So again, if you're interested, you can also email me. But those should pop up if you simply Google me and FTD and lifestyle, sure. But definitely on the All-FTD website, those are all aggregated.
Wonderful, wonderful. So a couple questions have come in. You talked about physical activity, cognitive engagement, cardiovascular health. Folks are asking about diet. Is there anything that's been researched in that area that you could speak to?
Yeah, great question. Oh, and I stopped sharing my slides, so I won't show them again. I did have a backup slide on this, but essentially this has not been well studied in FTD yet. I think diet, it's a complicated factor because it's so influenced by environment, availability, resources, and the individual. I will say in terms of general brain health, what we're seeing is that diets that are high in vegetables, whole grains, fruits are associated with about 30% reduced risk of stroke and about 30% reduced risk of age-related cognitive changes. Some people like to use the heuristic of the Mediterranean diet. This has been a diet, Mediterranean DASH diet, that's been shown to be quite good for the heart. And there have been some associative studies that have shown that these types of diets are associated with lower dementia risk in general. Again, these are diets that are built around whole grains, legumes, vegetables. And then on top of that foundation is when you build a little bit more protein, mostly comprised of fish, a little bit of poultry, smaller amounts of red meat, and then sort of sweets and fats as the smallest amount at the top of that diagram.
So another question moving on, we're trying to get through multiple questions, and that is something you talked about, but really maybe going back to and highlighting again. So if a person has a diagnosis of FTD and potentially genetic based, what's your top line recommendations for things to consider lifestyle changes? And then we'll throw it back to you and Penny. What lifestyle factors are you changing in terms of your cognitive health? What's top on your priority list?
Great questions. And I think they might be one and the same. So for people who are at genetic risk for FTD, I think some of the data that we're seeing and that align with the broader dementia prevention literature are heart health and physical activity and cognitive and social activity. So keeping the body and the mind and the heart active, healthy, working well. Those are the things I try to do too. I will say, I try to mix it up. So I have different exercise regimens depending on what mood I'm in, because I think the most effective exercise regimen is the one that you do. So it doesn't have to mean, again, that you're running marathons or 5Ks or 10Ks. I like to do a mix of things so that in case any of the specific activities are good for brain health, then I'm doing them. So I'll do things like yoga, which provide both sort of cognitive mental health benefits as well as the physical health, as well as I'll do some cardiorespiratory work, so running, I try and do hills when I can. The other things I try to do are keep a good sleep schedule. I didn't talk too much about sleep, but regular times of sleeping, and promoting myself into my social and new open ways of thinking. I think that's one of the through lines that I've been trying to embody, is being open as we get older. I think this is the way that the brain can grow, and there's a lot of studies that have shown actually that openness is associated with better, more successful aging more broadly. So yeah, being open to that new artist or the new technology and trying to embrace it as much as I might fight against that sometimes.
I know years ago I saw a study about how people love crosswords, and they'll talk about how crosswords are so good for your brain health, but that if you've done crosswords for 50 years, doing another crossword isn't necessarily as good. If you've never adopted an instrument and you start to try something new, like a new instrument, that's where you're challenging yourself to try something completely new. Dr. Casaletto, is that something that, I mean, it's quite a few years ago that I'd seen those studies. Does that resonate with what you've heard as well and what you've seen?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the tenet that I believe in. So essentially, if it feels easy, it's great, keep it up. And you might stretch those brain cells a little bit further if it doesn't feel easy. So thinking about the thing that is new for you, and so it's hard because that's different for every person. But you can do this in a lot of different ways. So trying a new route to the grocery store, or trying a different type of puzzle if you like puzzles, meeting a new type of person that you might not have met. But that's exactly right. So once you've trained that brain circuit, it's pretty much good. And so if you want to build on top of a brain circuit, we've really got to push ourselves to learn something new. And it's harder and it's going to feel hard, but know that your brain is enjoying it.
Thank you. And I do wonder, I'm going to ask one more around sleep. If you wouldn't mind expanding a little bit on that and sleep apnea, because that is something I've heard a lot of in relation to brain health. Would you mind just expanding a little bit more about what we know or don't know about for FTD?
Yeah, so general brain health, sleep and consistency of sleep is probably what we're going to be finding out is the most important when it comes to brain health. So it's not that everyone needs to get exactly, 8 hours of sleep every day, although I think that's a good heuristic. Some people are a little bit less than that, some people are a little bit more than that. But having every cell in our body has a circadian rhythm to it. And so keeping our bodies on that rhythm is actually really helpful for the body because it has time for active and breakdown of an accumulation of things, as well as that sort of rest time where it can repair. So that's more broadly. And then in terms of frontotemporal dementia, we're seeing that different types of clinical syndromes of FTD have different sleep difficulties. So for example, in progressive supranuclear palsy, there's a difficulty where the nucleus that helps us go to sleep is dysregulated. So these patients are actually awake a lot more and have a lot of micro awakenings throughout the night. And so that can be really challenging. There's some clinical trials that are in the works to look at different types of medications that could potentially help with that. And in terms of behavioral therapies, there are incredibly efficacious tools like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBT for insomnia, which are tools that someone might consider using if they're having some difficulties with sleep. But yeah, again, I'll just say sleep is the time that our brain gets rid of all of the junk and debris that it's accumulated each day. And so when we don't have that restorative sleep, it's at a higher risk for development of more difficulties as we get older.
Thank you. All right, I think we're about out of time, so thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Casaletto. It's time for our final break of the day here at the Education Conference. Please join us back here in 15 minutes. Our final session will begin at 4:30 Central Time. Thank you.